Welcome to The Deep Dive. Today we're really digging into something significant, a whole series of developments really that seem to be interconnected. We're looking at how the boundaries of presidential power are being reshaped, how constitutional norms, things we sort of took for granted, are being challenged. And importantly, how all this is hitting the American economy in some, well, pretty significant ways. We've gathered quite a stack of sources, articles, legal documents, economic reports, analyses, and they paint a picture, a pattern. It stretches from, street-level incidents in Washington, D.C., right up to complex federal economic policies, and it even touches the core of what civil liberties mean. Okay, let's unpack this.
Absolutely. Our mission today really is to connect those dots. Because these headlines might seem separate, maybe unrelated at first glance. We want to explore the legal arguments, the actual court filings, understand the political thinking behind these moves, and crucially, look at the real-world effects. The goal isn't just to tell you what's happening, but to help you grasp why it matters, why it's important for the basic structures of our society, and, how it could impact you. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes really clear these aren't just random occurrences.
Okay, so let's start right there in Washington, D.C., because that seems to be ground zero for some of the most dramatic constitutional questions right now. It's interesting. D.C.'s legal setup is kind of unique, isn't it? Most people think one attorney general per state, but D.C. has two.
That's right. It's a bit confusing sometimes. You have the U.S. Attorney for D.C., who handles most federal crimes, represents the federal government's interests within the district, but then you also have the locally elected Attorney General for the District of Columbia itself. And that's Brian Schwab. His job is to defend D.C.'s local laws, its residents, its government.
And it's Brian Schwab who's just made a big move, filed a federal lawsuit. We're hearing it was filed strategically late on a Friday afternoon.
That's the report. Filing late on a Friday is often a tactic to either bury news or, perhaps in this case, get ahead of potential weekend actions.
And the trigger for all this?
Yeah.
Well, the reported trigger anyway, was a street incident.
Yes. The sources detail a really unfortunate event. A 19-year-old apparently connected to the DOJ, also working for the Social Security Administration, got into a fight, jumped by some 14-year-olds. Awful incident, no question. But sadly, the kind of thing that does happen in cities.
But this specific incident was then used politically.
It appears so. Donald Trump seized on it almost immediately. He used it as the public reason, the justification to say D.C.'s local government just couldn't manage, couldn't keep order. And based on that, he announced the federal government was essentially stepping in, taking over.
And that's where Pam Bondi comes in, former Florida AG.
Exactly. She's reportedly been designated as a kind of federal commissioner, positioned effectively to override D.C.'s elected mayor and council. That's the crux of the immediate conflict.
Wow. Okay, so override local leadership based on one street fight. That sounds constitutionally charged.
It absolutely is. And that's what Brian Schwab's lawsuit targets directly. It's accusing the Trump administration of violating both the D.C. Home Rule Act and Article 1 of the Constitution itself. What's fascinating here and really crucial to understand is the context of D.C. governance. That Home Rule Act, back in 1973, was a huge deal.
But before that, D.C. residents didn't have much say, did they?
Very little. It was run largely by a commission appointed by Congress. The 73 Act finally gave residents the right to elect their own mayor, their own city council, manage local affairs, schools, police, budgets, like most other American cities. And this wasn't just D.C. It was part of a whole movement in the 70s, 80s, 90s, pushing for more local control, pushing back against distant authorities.
But there's always that asterisk with D.C., isn't there? The constitutional bit.
Exactly. That's the constitutional catch. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, the District Clause. It gives Congress the ultimate legislative power over the capital city, in all cases whatsoever, the text says. So Congress granted home rule, but it never fully gave up its ultimate authority. It could, in theory, take it back or change it.
But that's Congress, right? Not the president acting alone.
Precisely. The president's role here is very, very limited by the law. Congress already passed the Home Rule Act itself, specifically Section 740. It lays out exactly when the president can ask for help from the D.C. police, the MPD, in an emergency.
Okay, what are those limits?
They're quite specific. First, the request must go through the mayor of D.C., can't just bypass them. Second, it's temporary, only 48 hours max unless Congress is formally notified. And even then, it can't go beyond 30 days unless both the House and the Senate pass a joint resolution saying, okay, extend it. And crucially, even if the president does request assistance this way, the MPD officers don't become federal agents. They stay under local D.C. command. It's assistance, not a takeover.
So that's the lawful path. Request help through the mayor, temporary specific limits?
That's the lawful path. But what Pam Bondi is alleged to have done, based on Schwab's lawsuit, is, well, something entirely different. The lawsuit describes her executive order as essentially trying to decapitate the local government, sidelining the mayor, removing the police chief, and putting someone else in charge, the interim DEA head, Karen Cole.
So, not requesting assistance, but replacing leadership.
Exactly. The lawsuit frames it as a hostile takeover, not requesting assistance. That's the core legal argument. So Schwab is asking the court for two main things. First, a declaratory judgment, basically, an official ruling saying, yes, these actions were illegal and unconstitutional.
Just establishing the fact.
Establishing the legal fact. And second, injunctive relief, a court order telling the federal government, stop doing this and don't do it again.
And the specific legal claims.
They're throwing the book at it, legally speaking. Violations of the Administrative Procedures Act, arguing the government didn't follow the rules, didn't justify its actions properly. Abuse of discretion, claiming the decision was arbitrary, no real basis. Also, ultra-virus acts, that's Latin, basically means acting completely beyond your legal powers, like a CEO doing something the company charter forbids, and the big ones, separation of powers and district clause violations. Arguing the president grabbed power that belongs solely to Congress under the Constitution when it comes to D.C. governance.
It really feels like this isn't just about one incident then. It's got broader political undercurrents.
Oh, absolutely. Political analysts we've looked at widely see this as politically motivated. It's not happening in, say, Texas or a state that voted for Trump. It's always places like California or now D.C. Democratic strongholds.
So the argument is it's about undermining opponents,
Yep.
flexing muscle in places that didn't support him.
That's the interpretation many are drawing, yes. It fits a pattern, too. We've seen emergency declarations used before for things like tariffs, immigration actions, military deployments, often for situations critics argued weren't sudden crises requiring emergency powers.
And D.C. is unique in another way too, right? With its National Guard.
Yes, that's another layer. Unlike in states where the governor commands the Guard for state duties, the D.C. National Guard reports directly to the president. Always.
Why is that?
Two main reasons, historically. One, security of the federal government itself. The idea was the president shouldn't need a mayor's okay to protect federal buildings or functions in the Capitol. And two, remember, D.C. didn't have a mayor for almost a century, from 1874 to 1973. When the modern Guard system was set up, there was no local leader, so command fell to the president. Though it's worth noting, the D.C. Guard is pretty small, maybe 800 members, usually more involved in ceremonies than policing.
Okay, so the Guard answers to the president, but this current move seems focused on the city police, the MPD.
Exactly. And that's where that Section 740 provision in the Home Rule Act comes back in, that potential 30-day loophole, as some call it, the power for the president to take control of the MPD in an emergency if federal purposes are involved. It's a power the president has nowhere else.
So starting in D.C. makes a certain kind of sense if you want to push executive power. Legally simpler, maybe?
Arguably, yes. Legally simpler sets a visual precedent federal control on city streets and lets you build a narrative. We did it in D.C., maybe we need it in Chicago or Philly.
But outside D.C., the barriers are much higher.
Much higher. The big one is the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. That's the firewall. It generally forbids using the U.S. military for domestic law enforcement unless Congress explicitly authorizes it.
So what tools does a president have in the states?
Mainly two. They can federalize a state's National Guard, pulling it out from under the governor's control, or they can invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy active-duty federal troops.
The Insurrection Act. That sounds serious. What does it allow?
It's old, parts date back to the early 1800s, and it's broad. It lets the president use the military domestically to suppress invasions, insurrections, or when federal laws just can't be enforced normally. It has been used historically enforcing desegregation orders in the 50s and 60s, responding to major riots like in LA in 92, helping after big disasters like Katrina.
But the concern now is using it without a real emergency, using it as a pretext.
That's the fear legal scholars are voicing, yes. Using it pretextually, when there isn't a genuine, immediate breakdown of law and order that necessitates military intervention. That would be constitutionally uncharted and very dangerous territory.
And important to distinguish this from martial law, right? People throw that term around.
Hugely important distinction. Under the Insurrection Act, the military supplements civilian authority. The mayor, the courts, the police chief, they all keep operating. The military assists. Martial law means the military replaces civilian authority. takes over governance, shuts down courts potentially. It's incredibly rare in U.S. history, and past attempts like Lincoln's military tribunals were mostly struck down by the Supreme Court later.
So back to D.C. and this 30-day executive order declaring a crime emergency.
Yeah.
What happens after 30 days?
Well, unless Congress steps in and passes a specific law to extend it, the federal control is supposed to end. And right now, all indications are Congress has zero interest in doing that.
And even within the 30 days, can it actually work? Can you fix a city's crime problem in a month with a federal takeover?
Experts say almost certainly not. Real crime reduction takes time, resources, coordination, community trust. It's not a switch you flip from the White House. It's not a one-man show.
Especially when the stats seem to tell a different story.
Exactly. The timing was almost ironic. The same day Trump announced this based on a supposed crime crisis, D.C. released figures showing homicides down 32% from the previous year and another 12% this year. Overall, violent crime down 35%, lowest in over 30 years.
So not exactly a city spiraling out of control.
Not according to the data. It makes the emergency declaration seem questionable. If you want a comparison, think back to the actual D.C. crime wave in the 90s, fueled by the crack epidemic. That took years of hard work, community policing, education, partnerships to turn around, not a 30-day federal intervention.
So is this just political theater then? Optics over outcomes?
That's certainly how many local officials and residents seem to view it. They'd say, sure, we'll take real help. But real help means funding. More police officers, more judges to clear case backlogs, resources for the courts, not having their elected leadership sidelined.
And the bigger danger is the precedent.
Absolutely. If any local crime incident can trigger this kind of presidential intervention, what does home rule even mean anymore? Article, I wasn't written to be optional. It really makes you wonder about the checks and balances and how these power plays connect to other areas like the economy.
Yeah, let's pivot there from D.C.'s streets to the wider economic picture.
Yeah.
Because we're seeing some worrying signals there too, according to our sources. Let's talk inflation numbers. CPI versus PPI. Can you break that down?
Sure. Think of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, as a price tag you see at the checkout counter. It's what you pay for groceries, gas, rent, services. The PPI, the Producer Price Index, is earlier in the chain. It's the wholesale price, essentially. What businesses pay each other for supplies, raw materials, components, services needed to make the stuff you eventually buy. The cost of ingredients, basically.
And the latest PPI numbers, they were concerning.
They were. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the independent agency that tracks this, reported the biggest jump in 3 years. Business-to-business manufacturing goods up by 9%, services up 1.1%. Those might sound like small numbers, but in wholesale terms, that's a significant bump.
And why does that matter for us, for consumers?
Because those wholesale costs almost always trickle down. If a company pays more for its parts or its shipping, it's very likely going to pass that cost increase onto the consumer. So higher PPI usually means higher CPI is coming down the pike.
And we already know core CPI is running at, what, 3.1%?
Right. Core inflation, stripping out food and energy, is 3.1% year over year, which means your money buys 3.1% less than it did a year ago. You feel it at the grocery store. Maybe fewer eggs in the carton for the same price, maybe switching to a cheaper brand. It stretches the budget.
Yeah.
So this new PPI jump is like a warning siren, potentially more price hikes ahead for consumers.
And amidst this, there's also been criticism leveled at the agency reporting these numbers, the BLS, claims of rigged data.
Yeah, there's been a persistent narrative attacking the BLS, claiming the numbers are somehow politically manipulated. But economists stress the numbers themselves don't pick sides. The BLS is a professional agency. They use established methodologies. The numbers reflect the economic reality shaped by policies and market forces.
And speaking of policies, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, did an analysis recently on the impact of past tax cuts.
They did. The CBO is strictly nonpartisan. They looked at the effects of Trump-era tax cuts and some program reductions. Their finding was pretty stark. The wealthiest Americans saw their annual income go up by about $13,000 to $14,000 on average. But low-income Americans actually saw a decrease of around $1,200 a year in federal benefits, things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security support.
So not exactly trickle down.
Well, some economists are actually calling it the opposite, a vacuum-up economy. The idea is that wealth isn't trickling down. Specific policies are actively pulling it upwards, concentrating it at the top. They point to things like changes in capital gains taxes, weaker unions, regulatory changes favoring big corporations. It all contributes to this upward pull.
And this ties into housing, too. There's been criticism of the Fed keeping rates high, making mortgages expensive.
Yes, Donald Trump has frequently blamed the Fed. But here's the interesting thing the market data shows. Mortgage rates are actually already falling. The average 30-year fixed rate recently hit 6.58%, the lowest all year. And that's happening without the Fed cutting its main rate.
So why are they falling then?
Market pressure, mostly. Banks and lenders are competing for business in a slower housing market, so they're trimming their own rates to attract borrowers. It's the market working, not a direct Fed action driving it down right now.
Meanwhile, some Trump allies are pushing for a big Fed rate cut, like cutting it in half.
That's the push. But most economic models, looking at the current inflation numbers, actually suggest rates maybe should be a bit higher, maybe closer to 6%, to really cool inflation down. The worry is that a massive cut right now would just pump more heat, more demand into an economy that's still trying to get inflation fully under control. Could backfire.
And then there's this other idea, this sovereign wealth fund concept. The government buying stakes in private companies.
Yeah, that one raised a lot of eyebrows. The idea floated is for the U.S. government to use taxpayer money to buy shares in major corporations. Intel, Nvidia were mentioned as examples.
Like the auto bailout in 2008.
Well, that's the crucial difference. The auto bailout was a temporary emergency measure to stop a total collapse. The government got in, stabilized things, and got out as fast as possible. This proposal sounds more like an ongoing strategy. The government acting like a regular investor, like Norway or Saudi Arabia does with their oil money.
But the U.S. doesn't have vast oil revenues funding this. It would be taxpayer money.
Exactly, and it puts the government in a very weird position. Owning shares in companies it also regulates, competing with private investors. Critics call it state-run venture capitalism and worry about the conflicts of interest and the risk to public funds.
Let's look at those examples. Intel.
Right. The irony there is Intel doesn't even make most of its own advanced chips anymore. A lot of that manufacturing is outsourced overseas, Taiwan, South Korea. So what exactly would the government be buying into?
And Nvidia. There was a specific idea about China export controls.
Yeah, the suggestion was Nvidia could maybe get around the current U.S. ban on selling high-end chips to China if they paid the U.S. Treasury, say, 15% of the revenue from those sales.
So let them sell sensitive tech to China in exchange for a cut of the profits.
That's how it sounds. Which analysts immediately flagged as trading potential short-term cash for potentially huge long-term national security risks.
So the overall critique of these economic ideas is what? Flashy but risky?
Pretty much. Less about sound, sustainable economics, more about creating a transactional, maybe even performative image. Look, we're making deals.
Right.
But underneath, it potentially exposes taxpayers to massive risks. If these government investments go sour, guess who pays? And meanwhile, folks struggling with inflation aren't seeing relief, just maybe more economic uncertainty piled on top.
And connecting all this back, the power plays in D.C., these economic moves, analysts see a bigger goals, a kind of one-party country ambition.
That's the concerning through line some observers are pointing to, yes. A strategy aimed at neutralizing opposition, consolidating power, and changing the rules so that holding on to power becomes easier.
And a key method seems to be investigations. In quotes.
Exactly. Politically motivated investigations targeting high-profile Democrats, figures who've been thorns in Donald Trump's side. Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, NYG Letitia James, Senator Adam Schiff. The list goes on.
Now, to be clear, if someone breaks the law, they should be investigated.
Absolutely. No one is above the law. But the critique here is that these aren't presented as impartial probes based on solid evidence. They're seen as weapons, designed to generate negative headlines, sow suspicion, create a cloud of alleged criminality, whether or not there's any actual fire behind the smoke. The headline itself does the damage.
Can you give an example of this playbook in action?
Well, sources describe these secretive White House meetings where plans were apparently hatched to go after Schiff and James specifically. The tactics purportedly discussed involve things like phony criminal referrals, ginned-up allegations, maybe even trying to convene sham grand juries.
So Adam Schiff, what's the accusation against him? Mortgage fraud.
Yes. The claim centers on him buying a house in Maryland after becoming a senator to be closer to D.C., which is totally normal. But they're trying to spin it as residency fraud, ignoring the fact that the Constitution only requires you to live in the state when elected. Schiff says he has ethics opinions confirming it's all above board, but again, the goal seems to be the headline. Schiff under investigation.
And Letitia James, the NY Attorney General, she won that huge civil fraud case against Trump.
She did. $458 million judgment found a pattern of manipulating asset values. She also successfully went after the NRA, so she's made powerful enemies. And now, surprise, surprise, she's facing mortgage fraud allegations too.
What's the specific claim there?
It seems to involve paperwork details, allegedly misrepresenting how many units were in a multifamily property, maybe to get a better loan rate. Some issue with her father's info on a form. Look, mortgage paperwork is a nightmare. It's easy to make a minor error. But the focus isn't likely on finding a genuine crime, critics argue. It's about tarnishing her reputation. Political payback.
And who is being brought in to run these kinds of investigations?
Well, Pam Bondi, leading the DOJ effort, is described by sources as bringing in mainstream loyalists. People like Ed Martin, who defended January 6 participants and reportedly said he'd prosecute whoever Elon Musk wanted him to. That doesn't exactly scream impartiality.
Right. And then there's John Sarcone, upstate New York.
Yeah, he's another figure whose own past actions, like claiming an abandoned building as his residence, have raised questions. And placing these probes in upstate New York is seen as strategic. It's generally considered more conservative, redder territory. The idea might be to find a more sympathetic, Maggie-friendly jury pool than you'd get in Manhattan or Brooklyn.
So the overall strategy is chaos. Make everyone look dirty.
Create legal chaos, yes. Drain opponents' money and energy fighting these things off, smear their names, and ultimately maybe convince voters that everyone's corrupt so it doesn't matter anymore. Authoritarians often thrive when people stop caring about corruption, when they get exhausted by the constant noise. And it explains why certain leaders prefer appointees who ignore the rules, who say, "Watch me," when told you can't do that, because the public eventually just gets tired.
This raises an important question, though. What happens when these tactics hit fundamental civil liberties? Like with the recent California ruling on racial profiling.
Right. That brings us to a really crucial legal battle unfolding right now. Judge Dolly G. Frimpong in Los Angeles issued a ruling, a very clear one. She said, "ICE immigration and customs enforcement cannot detain or arrest people based solely on racial or ethnic profiling."
Meaning you can't stop someone just because of their skin color, their accent, the language they speak, or where they happen to be.
Exactly. Seems like basic fairness, right? Common sense. But here we are, still having to fight that battle in court.
And despite that ruling, there are reports of violations, ICE agents acting against it.
There are disturbing reports, yes. Allegations of agents in unmarked U-Hauls, black clothes, masks, sweeping through places like Home Depot parking lots, tackling day laborers who were just speaking Spanish. Actions that seem to directly contradict the judge's order against profiling.
So what did the Trump administration do in response to the judge's ruling?
They went straight to the Supreme Court, filed an emergency application asking the highest court to basically tear up Judge Frimpong's order immediately. The nuclear option, legally speaking.
And they're being upfront about wanting to use race or language as a basis for stops.
Astonishingly, yes. Their argument, laid out in their court filings, explicitly says they believe race, language, or even just being in a certain location should be enough for reasonable suspicion.
Remind us, what's reasonable suspicion?
It's the lowest legal bar for police to detain someone briefly, lower than probable cause needed for an arrest. It's basically an officer having a hunch, a feeling that something might be up. But the law has always been clear that suspicion can't be based only on someone's race or ethnicity. There has to be more.
Haven't we seen courts push back on this before? Like Arizona's Show Me Your Papers law?
Absolutely. The Supreme Court struck down key parts of that Arizona law precisely because of the profiling concerns. And Sheriff Joe Arpaio faced years of lawsuits and court orders over similar practices. This all comes down to the Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures.
And that protects everyone, even undocumented immigrants.
Yes. The Supreme Court has affirmed that. The Fourth Amendment is meant to stop the government from arbitrarily interfering with people's liberty based on prejudice or stereotypes. That's the slippery slope it was designed to prevent.
So the administration is betting on the current Supreme Court, the conservative majority, to overturn this precedent.
That appears to be the gamble. They're hoping the 6 conservative justices will agree with them, perhaps limit the scope of Judge Frimpong's order, or even go further and weaken the protections against profiling nationwide. They're also making a technical argument about whether one judge can issue such a broad order covering a whole district, tacking into recent SCOTUS skepticism about nationwide injunctions.
And this connects to other civil rights issues too, like the census fight.
It does. Remember the attempt to add a citizenship question to the census? That was narrowly blocked before the court shifted further right. When you put it all together, trying to change who gets counted, limiting courts' power to stop discrimination, expanding police power based on appearance or language, it looks like a concerted effort to redefine who the Constitution protects and how much it protects them.
And the argument they're making to the Supreme Court is blunt.
Very blunt. No nuance. Just basically arguing race and language should be enough for detention. Civil rights groups have called it morally bankrupt.
What happens if the Supreme Court agrees with them?
It would be a massive blow to civil liberties. It would essentially give a green light across the country for law enforcement to use stereotypes as a basis for stopping and detaining people. Think about the historical precedents Japanese internment, stop and frisk abuses. Once you allow suspicion based purely on identity, it's incredibly damaging and hard to undo. Right now, we're waiting to see if the Supreme Court will even take up the emergency appeal. The liberal justices will surely dissent, but they're outnumbered. It's a precarious moment. #, odor outro. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, what we've really seen today is a pattern, not just isolated incidents. We've seen this aggressive testing of presidential power boundaries in D.C., leading to these deep constitutional fights over home rule. We've seen what looks very much like the justice system being weaponized for political gain, using investigations to smear opponents. We've looked at economic policies that seem risky, potentially exposing taxpayers while not helping those struggling most. And we've seen direct challenges to core civil liberties, specifically the Fourth Amendment fight over racial profiling, reaching all the way to the Supreme Court.
So what does this all mean for you listening? It means these aren't just abstract news items. They're connected. These trends are actively shaping the future of how we're governed, the health of our economy, and the basic rights we have as individuals in America. They're pushing boundaries, challenging norms, and they really demand our attention.
It leaves you with a critical thought to ponder, doesn't it?
It really does. Yeah. Consider this. How much further can that line be pushed? The line between a genuine crisis requiring action and a crisis being used as a pretext for expanding power. How far can that go before the exceptional becomes the routine, before the rule of law starts to feel more like a suggestion than a bedrock principle? This deep dive shows us pretty clearly, I think, that these aren't just hypothetical questions anymore. They are playing out right now.